Let's see. Can we go back to the beginning here? There we go. All right, good morning. Before we start, I want to just meet one of my dreams in life of being a game show host. So, we're going to have a quick little game that I like to call Wise in Whose Eyes? And you'll see that on the screen. In this game, the goal is to figure out whose eyes is this wise in. The phrase that I'm going to put up there, is it wise in human eyes or is it wise in God's eyes? The first one, when one door closes, another will open. Is this wise in God's eyes or in human eyes? You know what? I don't think that's wise in God's eyes. A lot of us say it, but is it always true? If you read Matthew 7, it reads, "Ask and it will be given you, search and you will find, knock and the door will be opened." Not all closed doors are meant to remain closed, perhaps. Perhaps it is our job sometimes to knock on those doors. How about this one? God will never give us more than we can handle. Now you might be thinking, wow, this one does sound pretty good, but not in the Bible. If we look at Mark 10, we see that it says, "For mortals it is impossible, but for God all things are possible." And if we think about Joshua 1 verse 9, it's "Be strong and courageous because I am with you wherever you go." God doesn't necessarily promise that we won't have hard things, but God does promise presence with us during those hard things. So sometimes when the tough stuff comes our way, God is there to help us handle it. In fact, if we never encountered anything that we couldn't handle on our own, why would we need God? Last one. God helps those who help themselves. Have you picked up the pattern here? I was challenged as I was reading through the Sermon on the Mount recently by this passage. God makes the sun rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. God is not just about helping a certain group of people. I think God honestly wants to reach all of us and to be there for all of us. Not all of us will accept it, just like sometimes it's hard to accept the help from a friend or a family member when we're in challenging times. But God promises to be present and wants to be there for us if we are willing to accept it. Well, thank you for indulging me in this little moment of game showery. As I think about this idea of deep wisdom, I used this game show to illustrate the difference between conventional wisdom or common sense and God's deep wisdom. Conventional wisdom is often found in the things that we've learned along the way, the experiences that people have adapted, and then they become idioms or these phrases like we had on the screen a moment ago. But the reality is, typically, those phrases really only apply if you are in a privileged space or you're in sort of the majority or a powerful, comfortable place. I once read, if the same phrase is not true of the poor woman in Honduras, it's not the gospel. And so if those phrases that we just read don't apply to that person, that poor woman in Honduras, then maybe we need to take a second look. And that's where deep wisdom comes in. Because I think God's deep wisdom is formed out of a place of God's love, of God's compassion, and obviously a little bit of God's knowledge. Now, if we're being honest, I'm sure we would all love to always abide by God's wisdom. We show up here hoping to get some of that, and hopefully we do. But for some reason, we sometimes struggle to do that. It's not that God's wisdom isn't available to us. I believe it is. It's available to us everywhere we go. But it often runs contrary to how our world around us has taught us to live. Our culture and our systems prize individualism and prize keeping up the status quo. But God's deep wisdom pushes us to think about others, not only ourselves, and often disrupts the status quo when that status quo is being used to push down and oppress and marginalize people. I think God's deep wisdom reminds us that we are not an island. We are not separate, that we are all connected. And if this pandemic has taught us nothing else, it should be teaching us that we are all connected. That if only one person doesn't take precautions, that one person can infect many more. I'm thankful that in our congregation, we have been very careful to utilize the knowledge that we have learned and applied that in our own worship space. We wear masks, we keep distance. We unfortunately can't, I'll just say it. We should not be singing, which is hard. It's so hard. Deep in my soul, I long to sing with the congregation again, and yet we know that this is not something that is safe to do at this point. And there are still many unknowns as well. How long will the vaccines last? How long will we have immunity? And so we wait, and we continue to take precautions. If we look at our text for today in 1 Corinthians 1, 18 to 25, a surface level reading of this text might seem like it's encouraging us to pit our Christian ideologies against other ideas, like science. But I think this is a false distinction. I think these both fall into the same category. They're about knowing something, about information and theory. Paul calls out his contemporaries, the Jewish people who want signs, and the Gentiles that wanted some kind of wisdom, an argument. But the problem is that we think that wisdom and knowledge are the same thing. But that's not necessarily the case. Often our knowledge fails to see the nuance of situations because of our individual interpretations. In fact, this passage isn't at all about one person or one group being smarter than the other. It says it right in the first line of the text that Christy read. It's about how foolish the message of the cross is by our standards. So whether we have piles and piles of books like you see on the screen, we may still be unwise. Another struggle that we have as a people is we often desire for wisdom to be put in a nice little package, wrapped up all nice and neat. But much like the Jewish people wanting a sign and the Gentiles wanting wisdom, we want everything to be so simple. Some of us want a good show. Some of us want an intellectual argument. But in doing so, we miss on what God is offering to us. So what is God offering? I'm so glad you asked. So in our passage, it goes on to say, it is written that the wisdom of the wise shall perish. And that actually comes from this passage in Isaiah 29. The Lord said, because these people draw near with their mouths and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me, and their worship of me is a human commandment learned by rote. So I will again do amazing things with this people, shocking and amazing. The wisdom of their wise shall perish, and the discernment of the discerning shall be hidden. So, when Paul grabbed this one line from the text, he was hoping that his listeners would hear this and the rest of the passage around it, where the wise are actually those who say the right-sounding things, but don't always do what is right. Kind of like how Michelle was talking about the test, and how you could get all the right answers, but at the expense of doing what's right. This passage actually goes on to talk more about how the people in that time who were classified as wise would go around doing scheming things when they thought nobody was looking. And they would say things like, "Who sees us?" or "Who knows us?" And they end up being called tyrants and mockers and those with an eye for evil and those who deprive the innocent of justice. And so in this passage, God promises the prophet Isaiah that he's going to put to shame those that are doing this, that are saying one thing and doing another. He's going to make things right again. And that's where the message of the cross comes in. The message of a cross is not just about Jesus' death. I know we're in Lent and we're coming up on Easter, but it's not just about Good Friday. It's about Easter Sunday and Pentecost. The message of the cross, just like any story, isn't just one piece of the story, but the whole story that leads up to it. So the message of the cross begins with Jesus in the temple saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." So in this classic story arc form, that's kind of the exposition of how the story will go. It continues throughout Jesus' ministry of healing, hope, and reconciliation. Jesus working with the people, bringing anew. His work is, of course, interrupted by his execution, but through that and the love of God, we experience the resurrection, the promise of something new, the change that happens through discovering the empty tomb and what will come next. The message of the cross, this whole story of Jesus' life, death, resurrection, and then the coming of the Spirit, is foolishness because it's the exact opposite of the wisdom that the wise people, so-called wise people, in this Isaiah text were living. You see, God didn't come to earth in Jesus to give us new ideas or a new theory, to build this atonement theory of how we're made perfect. God came in wisdom embodied in Jesus. Embodied wisdom, because that's what wisdom is. Wisdom is not something that's just floating out there. Wisdom is something we live. The deep wisdom of God connects our knowledge of right and wrong and the activities that either promote it, if it's right, or oppose it, if it's wrong. The cross and the resurrection topple the tyrants and mock the mockers. It's like saying, "You gave me your worst, but it can never overpower my love for my people." The cross and the resurrection shine light on those who do evil, who practice injustice by saying, "You don't have the last word. My love does." So the deep wisdom of God, I think, can be something that is so simple and yet so complicated and difficult at the same time. In this phrase, "You are loved," All are loved because God is love. What flows out of that deep wisdom is an ethic and an activity that seeks to embody and share that love, because we know that we are all connected, and that without love, without that connection to other people, we may perish. In the beginning of Lent, started with Ash Wednesday, we affirm our humble place. We proclaim it even, that we came from dust and to dust we will return. All that we make, everything that we do will one day waste away. But our acts of love, no matter how foolish they may seem, can have an effect that lasts in eternity. Now, I'm not just talking about the fuzzy feelings of love. I'm talking about the love that looks like taking up your cross, being willing to suffer, to be uncomfortable, to be persecuted, to care and to love for one another. As we approach Easter, I hope we are receiving the message that each of us is loved by God, but also that each person that we meet every day, every minute, everyone is also a person who is loved by God and therefore is deserving of our love as well. The wisdom of our world is not enough. If we allow that wisdom to take place, we will always see some people as other, not part of our community. We'll see them as somehow less. And we'll try to be the ones that are winning while they are losing. But in the wisdom of the cross, the losers become the winners. Those who are less become more. And there is more than enough of God's blessing to go around. So contrary to the wisdom of our day, conventional wisdom, common sense, I offer you these 3 ideas, flipping the script on the phrases that I used earlier. When you see a door closes for one of our sisters or brothers of color, perhaps it's our job to knock on the door until it is opened. When it seems like abuse is being hurled upon someone is more than they should have to handle, maybe it's our job to help carry the load. And when we recognize that God has been good to us, how about not just helping ourselves, but helping those trapped in generations and systems of poverty and oppression? The deep wisdom of God may seem like foolishness, but I refuse to accept that choosing to embody the love of God would ever be a mistake for any one of us. It may seem like we are doing something crazy. We might end up being the weirdo. But I think being a weirdo for God is just where we are called to be. So may it be so on earth as it is in heaven. Amen.